Maduro would be indicted in New York for a deadly campaign of narco-terrorism against the United States, which was a strange thing to say. I think I heard him say, and you'll forgive me if I haven't remembered this exactly, I was listening to the speech in the newsroom, but I think I heard him say drugs like fentanyl mostly come from Venezuela. That's not factually correct. Less than 1% of fentanyl comes from Venezuela. It's not manufactured in the country. Neither is cocaine, really. Some cocaine is shipped through Venezuela from neighbouring Cuba. But to concentrate all of your rhetoric around international drug trafficking on Venezuela seems extraordinary until you take into account what Venezuela has in terms of oil. And, you know, I don't want to paint Nicolas Maduro in a cosy way whatsoever. He has been described as a dictator. He's been classified as such by the United States administration. And I don't think that many people will be sad to see him go. But nonetheless, that doesn't give the United States license to effectively invade the country and take over by force. People are already calling this colonialism in plain sight. It's definitely a breach of international law. So how do you feel about that? How do you feel about this extraordinary moment in history? 03456060973 is the number to call. Well, we're joined now by Professor Annette Idler, who is Director at the Global Security Programme at Oxford and Associate Professor at the Blatnovic School of Government. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. What is your response to what we've heard from Donald Trump today?
Thanks for having me. Well, I would say that the most consequential statement in that press conference was Trump saying, I quote, "We are going to run Venezuela." And that is really consequential because it signals occupation-style control. It's not a limited operation. And that means that the US, in a way, is moving from an intervention to something that is explicit nation building, something that actually Trump himself once criticized in Iraq. And apart from that, I mean, to publicly display Maduro blindfolded and his language of humiliation that he's been using against Maduro is, of course, also highly provocative and escalatory. So we don't really see this as a moment where things might calm down right now. No, Trump also, he threatened a second and much larger attack, which can just create even more escalation. So it's not just this moment that is historic, as you said, but also, unfortunately, the potential of even further escalation that we're seeing here.
What would further escalation look like, that further larger attack? Would that be contained to Venezuela, or is he talking about neighbouring territories as well, do you think?
Well, he's talking about Venezuela right now, but we need to keep in mind that what's happening in the region is really intertwined. I mean, I myself have spent lots of time doing research on the ground in the border between Colombia and Venezuela, and this is where you see many armed groups, militias, also Colombian armed groups that are inside Venezuela, like the ELN, for example. So you need to think about this really as a cross-border issue. And of course, in addition to that, it's very likely that we see a massive flow of migrants, of refugees. We've seen more than 7 million people already leaving Venezuela in the past decade, not related to the current situation. But that has already been happening, and it's very likely that this will continue. So we see a potential of a regional destabilization if we don't get the region on board, which right now is not the case. Right now, it's really the US imposing the events on Venezuela and the Latin American region.
I'm looking at some of the texts that are coming into the studio, and there are a lot of people who are feeling shocked and blindsided and dismayed by what they've heard today. But there are a couple of people, and I can't work out whether it's because nothing Trump does is ordinary or precedented, but there are a couple of people who don't seem to think that this is a very big deal. And I suppose in the context of, you know, what is actually an ongoing genocide in Gaza, and also Putin being allowed to invade Ukraine seemingly without much in the way of consequences, this could seem like just another incident. But what makes this extraordinary and different, do you think?
Well, first of all, the last time we've seen something slightly similar in the Western Hemisphere was in 1989 in Panama, when the US intervened. So just thinking about that, right? That it's now in the Western Hemisphere happening, that is something new. But also the way in which kind of three motifs here are really intertwined is different. So first of all, it's regime change, of course, which is now has become explicit. But it's also domestic politics, because Trump has been using that as a kind of to foster his war on drugs narrative, even though, by the way, we know that the militarized drug policy has failed for over 50 years. And then thirdly, and maybe that's the most crucial point, is that he made it very clear, even right now in this press conference, that it is about oil, right? This is about economic control. Trump explicitly invited US oil companies into Venezuela. So this is no longer framed as a law enforcement or counter-narcotics issue only. It is about who governs Venezuela and, of course, on whose terms.
What do you anticipate the international response to this is going to be?
Well, we've already seen strong condemnation from Russia, from Iran, from Cuba, but also from Colombia. So this is internationalized. You might argue, well, Russia, Iran, Cuba, they are also Venezuela's allies. But also European allies are calling for de-escalation. They're calling for the adherence to international law. I mean, one issue was, for example, that Trump didn't inform or consult Congress also in advance of the operation. So there's lots of concern about the process in which this happened, and of course also what that means in terms of the lawfulness, which right now is very questionable whether this can be defended in that sense.
And there is a degree of murkiness here. I think some people who are just kind of catching up with the history of Venezuela now because there is a need to know it suddenly. How would you categorize the rule of Nicolas Maduro?
Well, it is a illegitimate ruler, if you want to put it that way. So both in the elections in 2018 and in the elections in 2024, he claimed to be the winner, even though that was not the case according to the opposition and according to the international community. So in that sense, he seemed to be not the rightful president of the country. And that's, of course, also why there's definitely lots of people who would rather see him go. In addition to that, Maduro has been, he has been accused of being involved in the drug trade. Lots of officials in the Venezuelan government, they are part of kind of these operations involving organized crime and drug trafficking. But here again, we need to be very careful with how exactly we look at that. Trump, he claimed that Maduro is the head of the so-called Cartel de los Soles. But that cartel in itself, it doesn't exist as a group. It's an umbrella term to look at corrupt officials. So yes, there is evidence that the Venezuelan government is definitely involved in drug trafficking, and that needs to change. And also the kind of illegitimate way in which Maduro has been ruling needs to be changed. And I'm sure lots of Venezuelans will be very happy about that. But again, it's about how you effectuate that change. And it's about understanding that you need, first of all, the kind of the inclusion and the buy-in from the local Venezuelans. And you need to have a plan for the day after that involves Venezuelans, that involves the region, having regional cooperation, rather than imposing something that does kind of invoke those Cold War era interventions and, to some extent, the kind of colonial aspirations of countries in the past.